class. So we're going to be continuing on what we started yesterday, which is identifying patterns and making rules for linear functions with two operations. Again, those two operations is going to definitely be multiplication and then addition and subtraction. So quick review, operations are addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. A function equation is an equation, where every input has only one output. A linear equation is an equation where it creates a line due to the constant rate of change, which is another way to say that m stays the same. And we're going to be using that a lot today. F of x equals mx plus b is our linear equation. So I changed the steps a little bit because I had a little time to reflect and I realized that there's another way I can teach you this. So if you were using yesterday's way and you're like, this makes sense to me, I'm into it, I am successful with it, that's awesome. Stay with that. If this way, the one I'm about to introduce, works a little bit better for you, then you know you have something that'll work for you, and I recommend using that instead. So looking at number one, this really doesn't change. Examine the input and the output. Ask yourself, how did the input turn into the output? Now these two steps do change. So we're going to look at the out column. So that up and down column with all the out numbers. And we're going to look to see how is that changing. So that is actually a representation of the rate of change. So that would be the m, or the amount we multiply by. Then we're going to look at the difference of the out and the value that was created when we multiply the in times the m that we just found. And that is the value of the b, or what is being plus or minus. And this will all make sense in just a moment. So once you have an idea, test each pairing. And if it works for each pairing, write down the rule in terms of x and f of x, which f of x will mean y. So f of x equals mx plus b, where we add or subtract the b and we multiply the m. So now let's try what I just said. So I said to look over here and you're going to figure out what the difference is. So I'm looking at the output column and I see it goes -5 to -11 to -17 to 23. All right, so a couple things I noticed immediately. One, there's negative numbers. So that means I'm multiplying by a negative. So right away, I can say I am multiplying by a negative. Now to determine what we're multiplying by, and this was what we looked at this one. 5 to 11, 11 to 17, and 23 to 17. Now that's changing by 6. I'm subtracting 6 each time. So that means it's going to be -6. So 1 times -6 equals -6. Now you can see that, oops, I wrote -5. -5 and -6 are not the same number. So what could I have done to this to make it equal -5? So I am using negatives. I'm using negatives for a reason, because they are very popular in the Regents and I want us to be successful with them. So we have -6 plus 1 would equal -5. So then I actually figured out my rule. So I am going to be multiplying. I hate using the x for multiplication, but it's such a pain to use it the other way. But I am going to do that for you guys. So I'm going to insert an equation. You're going to see me do some formatting. There we go. So I'm multiplying by -6. This just makes my math teacher heart so much happier. Multiplying by -6, which equals, so 1 times -6 equals my -6, plus 1 would equal -5, and that would be my rule. Now I have to make sure this works for all of them, right? So we have, I'm going to grab this, 2 times -6 equals -12. And then I have plus 1, because we have to do the same each time, and that would equal -11. Let's test it for the next one. We have -6 times 3, which would equal -18. Forgot my negative. And then if I plus 1, which is part of my rule, that would equal -17. Last but not least, bringing it home, making sure it works, we have 4 times -6 equals, which would equal -24 if memory serves me correct, plus 1, and that would equal -23. So that's how I figured out my rule. So let's review, just because it is a lot to comprehend. It's going to make it all look the same. I knew right away, just because of 1 to -5, that my first clue is we're multiplying by a negative, because I had a positive and I turned it into a negative. And one of the ways you can do that is multiplying by a negative. The other way I figured it out is I went from -5 to -11, which means I went down by 6, remembering that when it's negative numbers, the bigger they are, the smaller they are. So I knew I was going to be multiplying by -6 because that is my rate of change. Looking at the output, that is how it changed. However, looking at 1 times -6, that equals -6. So there is the second operation to get to -5. -6 plus 1 equals -5. Now let's try it on the other one to make sure it works out. I'm going to grab my multiplication sign. Ooh, no, I cannot move on because I did not write my rule. So let's write a rule. F of x equals -6 times x, right? Anything in the input plus 1. And that will be my rule. Now moving on to my second one with my trusty multiplication sign that I grabbed. This one's a little more complicated, and I gave you zeros. And I gave you zeros because I think zeros just tell you so much information. So first things first, I have a change of sign, and we're going to see that in -1 to 3. So I know I'm multiplying with a negative once again. I also know that I will be adding with a 2. So 0 times anything equals 0. And that means 0 to 2, I had to multiply by some negative. So I'm going to leave that blank. And that will equal something. But, oh, that will equal 0 because it's times 0. And then I added 2, and that's how I got 2. So I already have a lot of information right away, just picking up these little pieces of clues. So I see a negative and a switch to a positive, and one common way to do that is by multiplying by a negative, right? Because a negative times a negative equals a positive. And I see that I have a 2 after multiplying something by a 0, which means that 0 times anything equals 0. So I add 2, so that means I have to plus 2. So already a lot of the work has been done. So let's look at, so we can't tell from here what I'm multiplying by. So let's go back to my trick with the output column. I went from 3 to 2 to 1 to 0. So I went down by 1. So -1 would be my rate of change. Now let's work it out. -1 times -1 equals +1. Plus the 2 that I got from the 0, that would equal 3. So I figured it out. So we have 0 times -1, which this would have been the case no matter what I multiplied by, would equal 0, plus 2, that equals 2. Then I want to try 1. So I have -1 times 1 equals -1 plus 2 plus 2 equals +1. Also works out. Now 2 times -1 equals -2. Then I add 2. Well, that cancels out, so that equals a 0. So that means I figured it out. So let's write it out. We have f of x equals -1 times x, right? Because I multiplied by my -1, and we write it before the coefficient. We write it as a coefficient in front of the variable. Then we added 2, as was the hint from the 0 to 2. We can simplify this, those of you who remember, so we just write -x plus 2. And that's it. You guys got this, and I look forward to grading your work.